Beverly Hills glittered beneath the velvet shroud of night, a city where wealth and glamour were stitched into its very fabric, every corner pulsing with the heartbeat of extravagance. Street lamps cast golden halos over sidewalks polished to a mirror sheen, their light mingling with the faint perfume of jasmine wafting from meticulously manicured gardens lining the boulevards. The hum of luxury engines, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and the occasional growl of a Ferrari, purred through the air, a mechanical chorus that announced the arrival of the elite. At the epicenter of this opulent kingdom stood La Lumière, a restaurant that reigned as a crown jewel, its name synonymous with sophistication and prestige. The building itself was a study in understated elegance. Floor-to-ceiling glass doors, framed in sleek chrome, gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting, reflecting a kaleidoscope of colors from within. Inside, crystal chandeliers dangled from the high ceiling like suspended constellations, their prisms scattering beams of light that danced across the dining room in a symphony of shimmer and shadow. The tables, draped in crisp white linens that seemed to glow under the chandelier's radiance, were adorned with silver cutlery polished to a mirror finish, each piece catching the light like moonlight rippling on a tranquil lake. The air carried a subtle blend of aromas, freshly baked bread, hints of truffle, and the crisp tang of expensive wine, creating an atmosphere that was as intoxicating as it was exclusive. Outside, a parade of sleek sports cars lined the curb, their glossy surfaces mirroring the chandelier's glow in a dazzling display of wealth. Porsches stood shoulder to shoulder with Lamborghinis, their curves sleek and predatory, while Ferraris added a splash of red to the monochrome elegance. Patrons emerged from these vehicles with the grace of royalty stepping onto a red carpet. Women floated out in flowing silk gowns, the fabric rustling like whispers as they moved, their jewelry glinting with the understated fire of diamonds and sapphires. Men followed in tailored suits, the sharp lines of their attire speaking of boardrooms, billion-dollar deals, and lives lived at the pinnacle of success. Their laughter and conversation drifted through the open doors, a symphony of privilege and poise that filled the night with a sense of effortless superiority. La Lumière was more than a restaurant, it was a stage, a sanctuary for the elite where every detail whispered sophistication. The faint clink of wine glasses as they toasted fortunes and futures, the meticulous folds of napkins arranged like origami art, the soft rustle of silk against polished wood, all of it wove a tapestry of refinement that enveloped the space. The staff moved with choreographed precision, their uniforms crisp and their smiles practiced, ensuring that every guest felt like royalty. This was a world where appearances were everything, where the right attire, the right demeanor, and the right connections granted entry into an exclusive club that few could claim. But tonight, an anomaly pierced this seamless tapestry of luxury, a figure whose arrival sent a ripple of discord through the carefully curated harmony. Shaquille O'Neal, a towering colossus whose name reverberated through the annals of basketball history, stepped through the glass doors with a slow, deliberate stride that seemed to defy the haste of the world around him. At over 7 feet tall, his presence was a force of nature, impossible to ignore, a mountain of a man who dwarfed the elegant surroundings. Yet his attire stood in stark, almost defiant contrast to the sartorial splendor that defined La Lumière's clientele. A simple gray t-shirt clung to his broad frame, its fabric slightly wrinkled and faded, as if it had borne the weight of a long, unremarkable day rather than the polish of a designer's atelier. Loose sweatpants swished softly with each step, their casual drape a far cry from the tailored trousers that dominated the room. On his feet, a pair of worn-out sneakers, faded to a dull gray, frayed at the edges, and scuffed from countless miles, squeaked faintly against the polished hardwood floor, a sound that cut through the ambient elegance like a misplaced note in a symphony. In a world where designer labels were a currency of identity, where Gucci and Prada were badges of belonging, Shaq's simplicity was a rebellion, a quiet but unmistakable defiance against the unspoken dress code that governed La Lumière. He paused just inside the entrance, his dark eyes sweeping the room with a calm, almost contemplative curiosity. The dining area stretched before him like a sea of elegance bathed in golden light, a landscape of refinement that seemed to pulse with life. Round tables dotted the space, each a small universe unto itself, crystal wine glasses catching the chandelier's glow in prismatic bursts, floral centerpieces of orchids and lilies exuding a subtle fragrance that lingered in the air, and diners leaning close in hushed, intimate exchanges, their voices a soft murmur beneath the music. In the far corner, a jazz trio played a gentle melody, the saxophone weaving notes through the air like silk threads, accompanied by the resonant thrum of a double bass and the delicate brush of drums against cymbals. The music wrapped the room in a cocoon of serenity, softening the edges of the evening and lending it an almost dreamlike quality. Shaq chose a table near the back, tucked away in a shadowed corner close to the kitchen entrance, a spot that seemed almost forgotten amidst the grandeur of the central dining area. It was an unassuming place, far from the hub where the wealthiest patrons held court under the brightest lights, their voices carrying the weight of influence and power. He lowered himself into the chair, his massive frame making the delicate furniture seem fragile, almost childlike beneath his bulk. The wood creaked faintly under his weight, a subtle protest against the loaded bore, but he settled in with an ease that belied his size. His large hands rested lightly on the table, fingers interlaced in a gesture of quiet repose, and he exhaled softly, a breath that seemed to carry the weariness of the day and the calm of a man at peace with himself. His goal was clear: to blend in, to experience the evening without the spotlight that so often followed him like a relentless shadow. He had lived much of his life under scrutiny, on the basketball court where every move was dissected, in the public eye where his every word was weighed, but here, in this moment, he sought something simpler, a chance to be just another diner in a sea of faces. But in a place like La Lumière, where every glance was a judgment and every detail a statement, anonymity was a luxury even a man of his stature couldn't afford. The diners nearest the entrance noticed him first, their eyes drawn to the towering figure who seemed to fill the doorway even after he'd stepped inside. A middle-aged man in a charcoal gray suit, his cufflinks glinting with the understated wealth of custom craftsmanship, leaned toward his companion, a woman in a burgundy dress with pearls glistening at her throat like drops of moonlight. "Is that Shaquille O'Neal?" he murmured, his voice low but tinged with disbelief, as if the name alone carried a weight that clashed with the scene. The woman glanced over, her perfectly manicured hand pausing mid-air as she lifted her wine glass, the ruby liquid catching the light in a brief flare. "I think you're right," she replied, her tone a blend of recognition and confusion, her brow furrowing slightly. "But why's he dressed like that here? This isn't a gym." Their exchange sparked a ripple of whispers, spreading from table to table like a breeze rustling through autumn leaves. Some recognized him instantly, the basketball titan whose dominance on the court had etched his name into the annals of sports legend, a man whose larger-than-life persona had transcended the game to become a cultural icon. Others squinted, uncertain, their curiosity piqued by the incongruity of his appearance in a setting so steeped in formality. "That's Shaq, isn't it?" a young man in a pinstripe suit whispered to his date, his voice barely audible over the jazz. "I saw him on TV once, he's huge." His companion nodded, her eyes wide. "But he looks so ordinary. What's he doing here?" Shaq seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps he'd grown so accustomed to it that it no longer registered. His gaze drifted across the room, taking in the details with a quiet appreciation, the way the light danced on the chandeliers, casting fleeting patterns on the walls, the faint clink of silverware against fine porcelain as diners savored their meals, the occasional burst of laughter from a table near the window, where a group of well-heeled patrons toasted some private victory. He leaned back slightly, the chair creaking again under his weight, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, softening the hard lines of his face. To him, this was more than a meal, it was a moment to observe, to absorb the world around him without the pressure of performance, a rare pause in a life that had so often demanded he be larger than life. But the world, as it so often did, had other plans, its currents already shifting around him like a tide he couldn't control. The whispers grew, a low hum that underscored the jazz, and eyes lingered longer, some with recognition, others with judgment. Shaq's simplicity, his refusal to conform to the expected script of La Lumière, made him a puzzle the room couldn't solve, a riddle wrapped in a gray t-shirt and worn sneakers. At the reception desk, Emma stood like a sentinel guarding the gates of an ancient citadel, her posture rigid with practiced poise that bordered on severity. She was young, perhaps in her mid-twenties, with sharp features softened by the careful application of makeup, rose-tinted lips that curved in a perpetual half-smile, a dusting of blush that lent her cheeks a faint glow, and eyeliner that accentuated her hazel eyes, giving them a piercing quality. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, every strand secured with military precision, a testament to her meticulous nature and her unwavering commitment to the image she projected. The pristine white uniform clung to her slender frame, its crisp lines a symbol of her role in this temple of elegance, a badge of honor she wore with pride. She'd worked at La Lumière for years, 3, to be exact, though it felt like a lifetime, long enough to feel a proprietary pride in its reputation, long enough to believe she understood who belonged within its hallowed walls and who didn't. She'd seen the city's elite pass through these doors night after night, tech moguls with private jets parked at LAX, Hollywood stars whose faces graced magazine covers, heiresses whose wealth stretched back generations. Each one was a walking advertisement of success, their attire a uniform of privilege, Rolex watches glinting on wrists, designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm of entitlement, voices dripping with the confidence of those who'd never known doubt. To Emma, they were the embodiment of La Lumière's ethos, and she was their gatekeeper, their usher into a world where status was both currency and creed. Her smile was a professional mask, one she'd perfected through countless interactions with this glittering parade. It curved her lips just enough to convey warmth, a practiced gesture that reassured guests of their welcome, but it never reached her eyes. Those eyes, sharp and assessing, betrayed a different truth, a quiet arrogance, a certainty that she held the power to judge, to separate the worthy from the unworthy with a single glance. When her gaze landed on Shaq, that certainty sharpened into something colder, a blade honed by years of upholding an unspoken standard. She took him in with a single, sweeping glance, his wrinkled t-shirt hanging loosely over his broad shoulders, his baggy sweatpants pooling slightly at the ankles, his scuffed sneakers leaving faint smudges on the pristine floor, and her lips tightened almost imperceptibly, a reflex she couldn't quite suppress. Someone like him doesn't belong here, she thought, the words forming a silent verdict in her mind, etched with the finality of a judge's gavel. To her, La Lumière was a sanctuary for the refined, a place where guests were expected to mirror its grandeur in their attire, their manners, their very presence, and Shaq, with his casual disregard for these unspoken rules, was an anomaly she couldn't reconcile. In her eyes, he was an intruder, a misfit who dared to step into her carefully curated world with the audacity of someone who didn't know his place, or worse, didn't care. She'd dealt with outliers before, tourists who stumbled in unaware, young professionals stretching their budgets for a taste of luxury, but they'd always carried a hint of deference, a nervousness that acknowledged their precarious footing. Shaq, with his calm assurance and unapologetic simplicity, offered none of that, and it rankled her. She intended to make sure he knew it, to restore the order she believed he threatened with his very presence. Shaq approached the desk, his towering frame casting a shadow over the polished counter that gleamed like obsidian under the overhead lights. He offered a warm smile, his deep voice resonating with a quiet friendliness that filled the space around him. "Good evening," he said, the words simple and unassuming, a greeting that carried no pretense. "I'd like to book a table if there's one available." His tone was steady, almost soothing, a contrast to the clipped efficiency that typically greeted guests here. The words carried a weight that made Emma pause, a fleeting moment where his politeness disarmed her, clashing with the judgment she'd already formed like a wall of ice meeting a sudden flame. She blinked, caught off guard by the warmth in his voice, the absence of arrogance or entitlement she'd expected from someone of his size, his presence. But she recovered quickly, her smirk returning as she tilted her head slightly, sizing him up with a gaze that lingered a beat too long on his sneakers before flicking back to his face. "Good evening," she replied, her tone smooth but edged with condescension, a practiced cadence that masked her disdain beneath a veneer of professionalism. "But this is a fine dining establishment. Are you sure you want to eat here?" The question hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, a challenge disguised as courtesy that carried the weight of her unspoken verdict. She raised an eyebrow, her hazel eyes narrowing slightly, as if daring him to falter, to reveal the uncertainty she was certain lay beneath his calm exterior. Shaq met her eyes directly, his smile unwavering, a quiet fortress against the storm of her insinuation. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, unshaken by her tone, "I'd like to try the experience here." There was no trace of defensiveness in his words, no hint of irritation, just a calm certainty that seemed to deepen her irritation, like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples she couldn't control. Emma's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a crack in her armor she quickly masked with a practiced nod, her lips pressing into a thin line. "All right," she said, her voice clipped now, the warmth draining from it as she regained her footing. "Let me check the table availability. Please wait a moment." She turned away, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as she retreated behind the desk, each step a punctuation mark to her resolve. Her movements were brisk, almost theatrical, a performance meant to assert her authority in this small domain. Her thoughts raced as she pretended to scan the reservation list, her fingers hovering over the leather-bound book without truly seeing it. "This guy won't last long here," she mused, a smug satisfaction settling over her like a cloak. "He'll see the menu prices and realize he's out of his depth. Let's see how long it takes him to slink out." In her mind, she'd already scripted the evening. Shaq would fumble, embarrassed by the numbers on the page, and leave with his tail between his legs, proving her instincts right. She saw herself as the arbiter of La Lumiere's standards, a guardian of its sanctity, and he was a test she intended to pass with flying colors, a notch on her belt of self-assured superiority. When she returned, her demeanor was unchanged, cool, controlled, with a hint of mockery that curled the edges of her smile. "Follow me," she said, her voice clipped and commanding, a tone that brooked no argument. "I'll find a seat suitable for you." Shaq nodded, a simple gesture of acknowledgement, and followed, his long strides keeping pace with her brisk walk as though he were strolling through a park rather than navigating a battlefield of her making. She led him through the heart of the restaurant, past the central tables where the air buzzed with lively chatter and the clink of glasses raised in toasts. The diners there exuded an effortless confidence, their laughter mingling with the jazz in a harmony of privilege, their presence a perfect match for the setting, men in bespoke suits with silk ties, women in dresses that shimmered like liquid gold. But Emma didn't pause, didn't offer him a place among them. She kept walking, guiding him toward the dimmer, less glamorous corner near the kitchen, a deliberate choice that spoke volumes without a word. The air there was warmer, tinged with the faint aroma of sizzling butter and fresh herbs wafting from the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. The clatter of pots and pans echoed faintly, a reminder of the labor that fueled the elegance, a sound that contrasted sharply with the refined hush of the main dining area. She stopped at a small table, its surface bare except for a single folded napkin, a stark island in the sea of luxury. Turning to him, she offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a thin veneer of politeness stretched over her disdain. "This spot should match your style perfectly," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm as she dropped the menu onto the table with a light thud, a sound that carried through the nearby tables like a gavel strike. The gesture was intentional, a small act of defiance meant to underscore her point, to mark him as an outsider in a way that everyone could see. Shaq nodded, his expression unchanged, and lowered himself into the chair with a grace that belied his size. His smile remained, a quiet anchor in the storm of her disdain, a beacon of calm that seemed to glow brighter against her sharpness. He glanced at the menu, then back at her, his eyes calm and untroubled, as if he saw through her performance to something deeper, something she couldn't yet fathom. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice warm and steady, a single word that carried more weight than all her taunts combined. Emma hesitated, expecting more, a protest, a flicker of discomfort, a crack in his facade that she could exploit, but found nothing. His composure unsettled her, a silent rebuke to her carefully laid plans, a mirror reflecting her own pettiness back at her. She wanted him flustered, embarrassed, gone, out of her space, out of her control. Instead, he sat there, an immovable force, a mountain of calm that her words couldn't erode. She turned on her heel, her movements sharp and deliberate, a soldier retreating from a battle she hadn't yet won. As she walked away, she tossed a parting shot over her shoulder, her voice loud enough to reach the ears of those nearby. "Hope you enjoy this spot. Not everyone gets such a prime seat." The mockery was unmistakable, a barbed arrow aimed at his back, a final attempt to pierce his armor. A murmur rippled through the closest tables, some sympathetic, some curious, a low hum that underscored the jazz like a counterpoint. A young woman named Lisa, seated with a friend a few tables away, shook her head, her dark curls bouncing slightly with the motion. "She's so rude," she whispered, her voice tight with indignation, her brown eyes narrowing as she watched Emma retreat. "He didn't do anything wrong. What's her problem?" At a central table, bathed in the soft glow of a chandelier whose light spilled over them like liquid gold, an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, watched the scene unfold with quiet interest. Mr. Carter, a distinguished man with silver hair that gleamed like polished steel, sipped his wine, a deep red that stained the glass with its richness, and leaned toward his wife. "He's impressively composed," he murmured, his voice low but laced with intrigue, a tone honed by years of observing human nature. "Most people would have reacted by now, said something, done something. He's just there." Mrs. Carter nodded, her eyes following Shaq as he settled in, her fingers resting lightly on the table, adorned with a single emerald ring that caught the light. "There's something about him," she replied softly, her voice warm with a hint of admiration. "He doesn't seem bothered at all. It's almost as if he's used to this, or above it." Back at the reception desk, Emma leaned against the counter, her arms crossed casually but her posture tense, a smirk playing on her lips like a victor savoring a small triumph. She felt a twisted satisfaction, convinced she'd put Shaq in his place, relegated him to the fringes where he belonged in her meticulously ordered world. In her mind, he was a fleeting annoyance, a blip on the radar of her evening, someone who'd soon realize his mistake and leave, tail between his legs, proving her right. Yet beneath her confidence, a faint unease stirred, a whisper of doubt she couldn't quite silence. Shaq's silence, his unshakable calm, gnawed at her like a splinter under her skin. She glanced back at him, expecting to see a crack in his facade, a furrowed brow, a nervous shift, some sign that her barbs had landed, but found only that same steady gaze, that same faint smile, as if he were a statue carved from stone, impervious to her efforts. Tonight, La Lumière was about to become more than a dining room. It was poised to transform into a theater, with Shaq as its unwitting star and Emma as the antagonist in a drama she couldn't yet comprehend, a play whose script was still being written in the quiet spaces between their words. Word count for expanded Part 1, 200 words. Part 2, escalation and tension, expanded. Emma's irritation simmered beneath her polished exterior as she returned to her duties, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with a rhythm that matched the growing tempo of her frustration. Each step was a declaration, a staccato beat that echoed through the dining room, a sound as sharp as her mood. She moved between tables with an exaggerated grace, her movements fluid yet calculated, a dancer performing a role she'd mastered over years of service. Her smile, reserved for the proper guests, those whose attire and demeanor aligned with her rigid vision of La Lumière's clientele, flashed like a beacon of approval, a signal that they belonged in her world. But her eyes, those sharp hazel orbs that missed nothing, kept darting back to Shaq, seated in his shadowed corner like a quiet giant, an unyielding presence that refused to fade into the background. He was a thorn in her carefully constructed world, a splinter she couldn't extract, and she couldn't let it go. His calm refusal to bend under her judgment, to shrink beneath her pointed remarks, felt like a personal affront, a challenge to her authority that she was determined to crush. To Emma, La Lumière was her domain, a kingdom where she wielded the power to define who was worthy, and Shaq's very existence threatened that order. She lingered at a table of well-dressed regulars, a trio of middle-aged men in bespoke suits, their ties loosened slightly after a few glasses of Bordeaux, their laughter loud and self-assured. She laughed a little too loudly at their banal jokes, her voice ringing out in a forced melody that grated against the jazz trio's soft strains. "Another bottle, gentlemen?" she asked, tilting her head with a coy smile, her fingers brushing the edge of their table as if to anchor herself in their approval. They nodded, and she scribbled the order with a flourish, prolonging the interaction as her eyes flicked toward Shaq, gauging his reaction, or lack thereof. After this deliberate delay, she approached his table again, her steps slower now, a predator circling prey she was certain she'd cornered. In her hand was the leather-bound menu, its edges worn from years of use but still exuding an air of exclusivity, a tome of luxury that she wielded like a weapon. She placed it before him with a flourish, the motion theatrical, her voice dripping with mockery as she leaned in slightly, close enough for him to catch the faint floral scent of her perfume. "Would you like me to explain the prices?" she asked, her tone syrupy sweet but edged with malice, a velvet glove hiding a steel blade. "The most expensive item here is $350. She pointed to the corner of the menu where the filet mignon Rossini was listed, her manicured finger hovering over the words as if to emphasize the absurdity of his presence, the sheer impossibility that he could belong in a world where such extravagance was commonplace. Shaq looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers with a flicker of amusement that danced like a spark in their depths, a quiet defiance that she couldn't quite extinguish. "I'll have the filet mignon Rossini," he said, his voice as calm as a still lake under a moonless sky, as if ordering the priciest dish were no more significant than choosing a glass of tap water. The ease of his response, the casual certainty in his tone, hit her like a slap she hadn't anticipated. Emma faltered, her smirk freezing for a heartbeat, her breath catching as her mind scrambled to process his words. She hadn't expected that, certainly not the nonchalance with which he'd said it, as if the cost were a trivial detail, a footnote in a story he'd already written. Recovering quickly, she let out a derisive laugh, loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables, a sound that pierced the room's elegance like a shard of glass. "Oh, really?" she replied, her voice laced with scorn, each syllable a barb aimed at his composure. "I hope you know how to appreciate it. This isn't the kind of food everyone's accustomed to." The words were a taunt, a dare for him to admit he was out of his depth, to reveal the ignorance she was certain lurked beneath his calm exterior. Nearby diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the air growing heavy with the weight of her disdain. Lisa, the young woman who'd spoken earlier, leaned toward her companion, a man in a navy blazer with a thoughtful expression, his glasses catching the chandelier's light in brief flashes. "She's so rude," she whispered, her voice tight with disbelief, her hands clenching the edge of her napkin. "Why would she talk to a customer like that? He's just trying to eat." Her friend nodded, his eyes narrowing as he watched Emma, his jaw tightening slightly. "She probably thinks he can't afford it," he murmured, his tone low but firm. "She's digging her own grave with every word." Shaq, unfazed, smiled faintly, a gentle curve of his lips that softened the hard lines of his face. "Thank you for the suggestion," he said, his tone polite and warm, a shield of civility that deflected her barbs with a grace that only deepened her frustration. "I'm looking forward to trying it." His words were simple, unadorned, yet they carried a quiet power, a refusal to engage in her game that left her grasping for footing. Emma straightened, her hand resting on the edge of the table as she searched his face for a crack, some sign of discomfort, some hint that she'd rattled him, pierced the armor of his calm. But there was nothing. His eyes remained steady, dark pools of serenity, his posture relaxed, and that infuriating smile lingered, a beacon of resilience she couldn't dim. She turned away, her heels clicking sharper now, a staccato that matched the rising pulse of her irritation. As she passed the service counter, she muttered loudly to a colleague, her voice carrying with deliberate intent. "Filet mignon Rossini? He probably doesn't even know what he's ordering. People like that pick expensive items just to look fancy, but wait till the check comes, he'll bolt." The words were a performance, a public declaration of her superiority meant to rally the room to her side, to frame Shaq as the interloper she'd always seen him as. Her colleague, a wiry young man with a mop of dark hair, glanced at her but said nothing, his silence a tacit disagreement she ignored. Her barb drew more glances from the diners, a ripple of attention that spread like wildfire. Some shook their heads in silent disapproval, their lips pursed as they exchanged looks of quiet outrage. Others watched with growing curiosity, sensing the tension building like a storm on the horizon, dark clouds gathering over the pristine elegance of La Lumière. A woman in an emerald green dress at a nearby table whispered to her husband, "She's being awful. He hasn't done a thing to her." Her husband nodded, his brow furrowing. "It's unprofessional. She's making a fool of herself." Shaq sat quietly, opening the menu and skimming its pages with genuine interest, his large fingers tracing the elegant script as if it were a book of poetry rather than a list of dishes. The jazz trio shifted to a slower tune, the saxophone weaving a melancholy thread through the air, its notes curling around the room like smoke. He tapped a finger lightly against the table, keeping time with the music, a subtle rhythm that grounded him in the moment. The clatter of the kitchen faded into the background as he absorbed the ambience, his mind drifting, perhaps to the courts where he'd faced fiercer opponents than a judgmental waitress, or to the countless times he'd risen above petty slights with the same quiet strength he displayed now. Memories flickered through his thoughts, unbidden but vivid, the roar of crowds in packed arenas, the sting of sweat in his eyes as he powered through defenses, the weight of expectations that had shaped his career. He'd faced criticism before, judgments based on his size, his style, his very being, and he'd learned early that reacting rarely changed minds. Calmness, he'd found, was a weapon of its own, a shield that let the noise wash over him without leaving a mark. Here, in this gilded room, he wielded it again, a silent force that stood in stark contrast to Emma's escalating venom. At the central table, Mr. Carter set his wine glass down, the deep red liquid swirling briefly before settling, his silver hair catching the light as he turned to his wife. "He's testing everyone's patience here," he murmured, his voice a mix of admiration and intrigue, a tone honed by decades of watching people unravel under pressure. "It's fascinating," most would snap, but he's just sitting there, letting her dig deeper. Mrs. Carter nodded, her fingers tracing the stem of her glass, the emerald ring on her hand glinting softly. "He's not just enduring it," she replied, her voice warm with quiet respect. "He's commanding it, in his own way. She doesn't realize what she's up against, she's too busy trying to win." Emma, oblivious to the shifting mood, continued her performance, her confidence a fragile shell around her growing unease. She leaned against the counter, whispering to Jake, a younger waiter with a kind face and a nervous habit of fidgeting with his apron strings. "He'll leave as soon as he sees the bill," she said, her voice low but not low enough to escape the ears of nearby diners. "People like him just pretend to fit in, look at those shoes. He's here to prove something, but he'll crack, you'll see." Her words were a mantra, a reassurance to herself as much as a judgment on Shaq, a way to cling to the narrative she'd built. Jake glanced at Shaq, then back at Emma, his unease evident in the way his fingers twisted the apron tighter. "Maybe he's just here to eat, Emma," he said softly, his voice tentative, a plea for reason in the storm of her certainty. "Isn't that what we're supposed to do, serve everyone?" His question hung in the air, simple but pointed, a challenge she hadn't expected from the quiet, unassuming boy who usually followed her lead. Emma scoffed, rolling her eyes with a dramatic flare, her lips curling into a sneer. "Serve everyone? Sure, but not people who don't belong," she shot back, her tone sharp enough to cut. "He's a walking mismatch, look at him, Jake. He's out of place, and he knows it." Jake didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the floor, his shoulders hunching slightly. He didn't like confrontation, and Emma's certainty made it pointless to argue, a wall too high to climb. But he couldn't shake the feeling that she was wrong, that something about Shaq's quiet confidence hinted at a story she couldn't, or wouldn't, see, a depth she was too blinded by her own pride to recognize. The atmosphere in La Lumière grew heavier, the elegance of the evening undercut by an unspoken tension that coiled tighter with every passing moment. Diners began to take sides silently, some sympathizing with Shaq, their glances toward him soft with empathy, others waiting with bated breath to see how the drama would unfold, their curiosity a palpable force. Lisa's friend murmured, his voice low but firm, "She's making this personal, but he's not taking the bait. That's strength, real strength." His words were a quiet affirmation, a recognition of the power in Shaq's restraint. At another table, an elderly woman with a silver bob and a string of pearls adjusted her glasses, her movements slow and deliberate, her voice soft but firm as she spoke to her granddaughter, a bright-eyed girl in her early 20s with a cascade of blonde hair. "That girl's behavior is disgraceful," she said, her tone carrying the weight of years of wisdom. "He's done nothing to deserve it, nothing at all." The granddaughter nodded, her eyes flicking toward Shaq with a mix of curiosity and respect. "He's so calm," she replied, her voice hushed. Most people would have said something by now. Shaq, meanwhile, remained an island of calm amidst the gathering storm, a lighthouse standing firm against crashing waves. He closed the menu with a gentle thud and leaned back, his eyes drifting to the chandelier above, its crystals refracting light in a mesmerizing dance that seemed to hold his attention. The play of colors, gold, amber, a fleeting hint of blue, captivated him for a moment, a brief escape from the tension swirling around him. He clapped lightly when the jazz trio finished their piece, his applause a warm, resonant sound that cut through the room's murmur, drawing smiles from the musicians, a saxophonist with a graying beard, a bassist with calloused hands, and a drummer whose eyes crinkled with quiet gratitude. The gesture was small, a fleeting acknowledgement of artistry in a night marked by discord, but it shifted the room's focus, reminding everyone of his humanity amid Emma's relentless efforts to diminish it. She noticed, her frown deepening as she stood at the counter, her arms crossed tighter now, her nails digging into her skin. Why doesn't he react, she thought, biting her lip hard enough to leave a mark. He's doing this on purpose, trying to make me look bad, to turn them against me. The idea took root, a paranoid thread weaving through her mind, fueling her resolve to push harder, to break through the wall of his silence. Determined to escalate her campaign, she delayed his order further, lingering at other tables with exaggerated attentiveness that bordered on farce. She laughed too loudly at a businessman's tired pun, refilled glasses that were still half full with a flourish that spilled a drop of wine onto a pristine tablecloth, all while casting sidelong glances at Shaq, watching for any sign of impatience. He waited, patient and unhurried, his hands folded on the table, his posture relaxed as if time were a luxury he could afford to spend. The minutes stretched, each one a taut thread in the growing tension, a string ready to snap under the weight of her provocation. Emma's game was clear, to break him, to force a reaction that would justify her disdain, to prove her superiority in a room that was beginning to see through her facade. But Shaq's silence was a wall she couldn't breach, a fortress of calm that stood firm against her assaults. With every passing moment, her actions exposed her pettiness to a room that was turning against her, their whispers growing sharper, their glances more pointed, a tide shifting beneath the surface of La Lumière's gilded calm. The air in La Lumière thickened as Emma finally emerged from the kitchen, a silver tray balanced in her hands with a precision that belied the storm brewing within her. The filet mignon Rossini sat atop it, a masterpiece of culinary art that seemed to glow under the dim light of the corner, a slab of tender beef, its surface seared to a perfect caramel brown, crowned with a glistening slice of foie gras that shimmered with a rich, golden sheen, drizzled with truffle sauce that pooled around it like liquid midnight, flecked with dark specks of earth and decadence. The aroma wafted upward, a heady mix of savory meat, buttery richness, and the musky undertone of truffles, a scent that promised indulgence in every bite. She moved slowly, her heels clicking with deliberate force against the hardwood floor, each step a performance meant to draw every eye in the room, a spotlight she directed with the confidence of a seasoned actress. Her lips curved into a cold, challenging smile, a mask of triumph that hid the flicker of doubt gnawing at her edges. In her mind, this was the moment, her chance to seal Shaq's fate, to expose him as the outsider she'd pegged him for, to watch him crumble under the weight of a dish she was certain he couldn't comprehend, let alone afford. Her posture was rigid, her shoulders squared, as if she were carrying not just a tray but the full burden of her pride. She reached his table and placed the plate before him with a touch more force than necessary, the faint clink of porcelain against wood echoing in the hushed space like a gunshot in a silent night. The sound reverberated, a sharp note that cut through the jazz and drew gasps from nearby tables. "This is what you ordered," she said, her voice sharp and pointed, each word a barb aimed at his calm. "I hope you can appreciate it." The statement was a final jab, a thinly veiled accusation of his perceived inadequacy, a dare for him to falter under the scrutiny she'd orchestrated. Shaq glanced down at the dish, its aroma rising to meet him, rich and intoxicating, a sensory promise of the luxury he'd chosen. He looked up at her, his dark eyes steady, and offered a response that was as simple as it was disarming. "It looks delicious," he said, his tone warm and courteous, a deep rumble that carried a sincerity she hadn't anticipated. "Thank you." The words were unadorned, free of the defensiveness she'd expected, and they landed like a pebble in a pond, sending ripples of surprise through her carefully laid plans. Emma blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of his reply, the absence of any crack in his armor. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper but still audible to those nearby, her breath brushing against the air between them. "This dish is for connoisseurs," she said, her tone heavy with insinuation, a dare wrapped in velvet. "I'm guessing it's your first time." The words hung there, a challenge for him to admit he was out of his depth, to confess that he didn't belong in her world of refined tastes and exorbitant prices. Shaq's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching, a faint glimmer of amusement dancing within them like sunlight on water, a quiet defiance that refused to bow. "Thank you for the advice," he replied, nodding lightly, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of her provocation. "I'll enjoy it." His response dismantled her attack, turning her venom into a hollow echo that bounced back at her, exposing the fragility of her stance. His calm was a mirror, reflecting her pettiness in stark relief, and she straightened, her smirk faltering as she realized she'd failed to provoke him, to shake the foundation she'd assumed was weak. The room watched, a collective breath held as her carefully constructed narrative unraveled before their eyes. Lisa, at her table, could no longer stay silent, her indignation boiling over into words she couldn't contain. He just thanked her politely, and she still being sarcastic, she hissed to her friend, her voice brimming with outrage, her hands clenching into fists beneath the table. "Unbelievable, she's acting like he's committed a crime." Her companion nodded, his gaze fixed on the scene, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose. "She's trying to break him, but she's the one breaking," he murmured, his tone a mix of pity and disdain. "He's untouchable, she doesn't see it." At the Carter's table, Mr. Carter lifted his wine glass but didn't drink, the ruby liquid catching the light as he held it aloft, his eyes tracking Emma's every move with the precision of a hawk. "She has no idea who she's dealing with," he said quietly, his voice firm, a statement carved from years of observing human folly. "A man like that doesn't need to prove anything, he just is. She's embarrassing herself, and she doesn't even know it." Mrs. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line, her empathy for Shaq mingling with her disdain for Emma's behavior, her fingers tightening around her glass. "It's shameful," she murmured, her voice soft but edged with steel. "She's turning this into a spectacle, and for what? To feel superior?" Emma, unaware of the tide turning against her, scanned Shaq one last time, her eyes searching his face for a crack in his armor, a twitch of unease, a flicker of doubt, anything to validate her judgment. But she found nothing, only that steady gaze, those calm eyes that seemed to see through her, past her facade to the insecurity she hid beneath her bravado. A faint sense of defeat crept into her, a shadow she masked with another smug remark, desperate to reclaim control. "If it doesn't suit your taste, we've got simpler options," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Feel free to order if you need to, something more your speed." She turned away, her notebook clenched tightly in her hand, her knuckles widening as she strode back to the counter. The tray hit the surface with a clang that startled Jake, the sound ringing out like a bell tolling her frustration. "He's just pretending to be polite," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom, her eyes flashing as she glared at her colleague. "I bet he doesn't even know what he ordered. People like that only come here for attention, they don't belong, and he'll prove it when he runs." Jake frowned, his discomfort growing, his kind face creasing with unease as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Maybe he just wants a peaceful dinner," he said, his voice tentative, a quiet plea for reason amid her storm. "Isn't it our job to serve everyone, Emma?" His words were soft, almost swallowed by the hum of the room, but they carried a weight she couldn't ignore, a challenge to her worldview that pricked at her pride. Emma spun toward him, her eyes flashing with a fire that burned hotter with every setback. "Serve everyone?" "Sure, but not him," she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "He doesn't belong here, Jake, look at him. He's a joke, and he'll leave when he sees the bill, trust me." Her certainty was a shield, a wall she built higher with every word, but Jake's silence, his gaze dropping to the floor, his shoulders hunching, spoke louder than any rebuttal. He didn't argue, didn't push, but his discomfort hung between them, a quiet dissent she refused to acknowledge. Shaq began to eat, cutting into the beef with slow, deliberate motions, his large hands wielding the knife and fork with a precision that belied their size. The flavors burst on his tongue, rich, earthy, a harmony of textures that spoke of skill and care, the tender meat melting against the creamy foie gras, the truffle sauce adding a depth that lingered like a memory. He chewed unhurriedly, his expression serene, as if the drama swirling around him were a distant hum, a radio playing in another room. The murmurs of the diners grew louder, some indignant on his behalf, their voices rising in quiet outrage, others simply watching, drawn into the unfolding narrative like spectators at a play. He'd become the center of attention, not by choice but by the sheer force of his presence, a quiet giant in a room of noise. Then, the tide shifted, a seismic change that cracked the foundation of Emma's world. From the reception area, Mr. Thompson emerged, a middle-aged man with a polished demeanor, his suit crisp and his stride purposeful, a figure of authority whose presence commanded respect. His face bore a mix of concern and urgency as he made his way toward Shaq's table, weaving through the maze of diners with a grace born of years in hospitality, his polished shoes silent against the floor. The room noticed, heads turning, conversations faltering as forks paused mid-air, wine glasses hovered untouched. When he reached Shaq, he gave a slight bow, a gesture of deference that seemed almost reverent, his voice low but resonant with respect. "Shaq," he said, the single word carrying a weight that silenced the room, "it's such an honor to have you here. I apologize for the delay, we had no idea you were coming today." His tone was warm, tinged with a sincerity that cut through the tension like a blade through silk, a revelation that landed with the force of a thunderclap. Silence fell, thick and sudden, as every eye widened in disbelief, the air crackling with the shock of recognition. Shaq placed his knife and fork down with a gentle clink, looking up at Thompson with that same warm smile, unfazed by the shift. "It's no problem," he said, his voice smooth and kind, a deep rumble that soothed the room's jagged edges. "I just wanted to enjoy a quiet dinner." But the revelation hung in the air, its weight undeniable, a truth that rewrote the evening script in an instant. Emma froze, the tray still in her hand, her eyes locked on the scene as if time had stopped. "Shaq?" she thought, the name reverberating in her mind like a bell tolling her defeat. Did he just call him Shaq? Her heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, a wave of panic crashing over her as the truth sank in, cold and unyielding. Whispers erupted around her, sharp and accusing, a chorus of realization that drowned out her bravado. "That's Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend," a young man at a nearby table murmured to his date, his voice hushed but urgent. "He owns stakes in businesses everywhere, restaurants, companies, you name it." His companion nodded, her eyes wide, her voice incredulous. "And he's a philanthropist, gives millions away. How could she not know? The ripple spread, faces turning from curiosity to admiration, then to judgment as they landed on Emma, a spotlight she couldn't escape. Her face paled, the color draining from her cheeks as her hands trembled, the tray wobbling slightly as she gripped it tighter, clinging to it like a lifeline in a sea of humiliation. She glanced around, meeting eyes that now saw her, not as the poised gatekeeper of La Lumière, but as the architect of her own downfall, a figure exposed by the very man she'd sought to diminish. Shaq set his glass down with a soft thud and looked directly at her, his gaze piercing but not angry, a quiet command that made her want to shrink into the floor, to disappear beneath the weight of her misjudgment. "Miss Emma," he said, his voice steady and deep, cutting through the silence like a beacon, "what do you think about how customers should be treated?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of the evening's events, pinning her in place with its unyielding clarity, a mirror held up to her actions. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat, tangled in a web of panic and shame. I didn't know who you were," she stammered, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread that snapped under the pressure of his gaze, the room's scrutiny. Her excuse hung there, weak and hollow, a plea that fell flat against the truth he'd already laid bare. Shaq shook his head slightly, his brows furrowing, a subtle shift that deepened the gravity of his words. "You don't need to know who I am to show me respect," he said, each word clear and deliberate, cutting through the tension like a blade through fog. "Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity." His voice echoed, not loud but resonant, reaching every corner of the room, a proclamation that struck chords of agreement and reflection. Diners nodded, some murmuring quiet assent, others bowing their heads in contemplation, the weight of his truth settling over them like a blanket. Emma felt her legs wobble, her knees threatening to buckle as his words replayed in her mind, every taunt, every smirk, every calculated slight now a haunting echo that reverberated through her, a cacophony of regret. Her knuckles whitened as she clutched the tray, unable to respond, unable to justify herself against the tide of realization crashing over her. The room's eyes bore into her, a silent jury passing judgment, and she stood there, exposed, the antagonist in a story she'd written herself into ruin. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his massive frame settling into the wood with a faint creak, his gaze still fixed on Emma, though it softened slightly, the edge of sternness giving way to a flicker of understanding. "It's precisely because I'm not like other customers that you need to learn to treat everyone the same," he continued, his tone measured but firm, each word a stepping stone in a path he laid out with care. "Respect isn't something you reserve for people based on how they dress, how they speak, or what you assume they have in their pockets. It's the most basic thing every person deserves, rich or poor, famous or unknown, it doesn't matter." The words landed like stones in a still pond, sending ripples of realization through the room, their simplicity belying their profound weight. Emma lowered her head, her breath shallow and ragged, as his voice wove through her thoughts, unraveling the tapestry of judgment she'd clung to all night. Every taunt she'd flung, every smirk she'd wielded, every calculated slight she'd delivered replayed in her mind, a haunting echo that grew louder with each of Shaq's words, a mirror reflecting her actions in stark, unflinching clarity. She couldn't justify herself, couldn't escape the truth staring back at her in the faces of the diners, in the unwavering depth of Shaq's gaze. Mr. Carter, at his central table, gave a subtle nod to his wife, his silver hair glinting as he leaned closer, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of experience. "He doesn't need to raise his voice," he said, his tone a mix of admiration and certainty. "What he said, how he said it, it's enough to teach her a lesson she won't forget, maybe for the rest of her life." Mrs. Carter's eyes softened, her empathy for Shaq mingling with a quiet satisfaction at Emma's reckoning, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. "He's turning her mistake into something bigger," she murmured. "It's not just about her, it's about all of us." Lisa raised her glass but didn't drink, her eyes locked on Emma with a blend of disappointment and faint hope, her dark curls framing a face taut with emotion. "She'll remember this forever," she said quietly to her friend, her voice low but firm. "I just hope she changes, really changes, not just for tonight." Her companion adjusted his glasses, his thoughtful expression deepening. "She's got a chance to," he replied, his tone measured. "He's giving her that, even after everything." Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his polished demeanor unshaken despite the storm that had swept through his restaurant, his voice firm but not harsh as he addressed Emma. "We need to talk after your shift," he said, his words clipped but carrying a note of restraint, a promise of consequences tempered by professionalism. "But first, let me handle this." She nodded faintly, her eyes downcast, her face flushed with a shame that burned hotter with every gaze she felt upon her, a heat that seared through her bravado and left her raw. Shaq raised a hand, a simple gesture that silenced the room, his tone softening as he turned to Thompson. "There's no need to make this a bigger issue than it is," he said, his voice a deep balm that soothed the jagged edges of the moment. "I believe everyone can learn from their mistakes, as long as they're willing to change." His words weren't just for Emma, they were a gift to the room, a reminder of grace amid judgment, a lifeline extended to a woman who'd spent the night trying to sink him. He picked up his utensils and resumed his meal, cutting into the filet mignon Rossini with the same deliberate care, the act so ordinary yet so profound that it silenced the lingering tension, a quiet assertion of his humanity amidst the chaos. The flavors washed over him again, the rich beef, the creamy foie gras, the earthy truffle sauce, a symphony of taste that grounded him, a moment of peace in a night marked by strife. He chewed slowly, savoring each bite, his expression serene as if the weight of the evening had lifted, leaving only the meal and the lesson he'd imparted. The diners watched, their murmurs fading into a respectful hush, the room recalibrating around the man who'd turned their judgment into reflection. When he finished, Shaq set his knife and fork down with a gentle clink, dabbed his mouth with the napkin, and rose to his feet, his towering frame commanding the room without effort, a mountain rising from the plains. Every eye followed him, the silence broken only by the faint clink of glasses and the distant strains of jazz, a melody that seemed to underscore his presence. He stood there for a moment, his broad shoulders squared, his dark eyes sweeping the room with a calm authority that needed no words to assert itself. "This restaurant was founded to welcome everyone," he said, his voice deep and resonant, a rumble that filled the space like thunder rolling over hills. "No matter what they look like, no matter where they come from, that's the philosophy the founders, myself included, have always believed in." He paused, letting the revelation settle, his gaze moving from face to face, ensuring his words landed with their full impact. The admission struck like a gong, a collective gasp rippling through the room as diners and staff alike processed the truth, that the man they'd watched endure Emma's disdain was not just a guest, but a creator of the very space they occupied. "Unfortunately, today, we failed to uphold that belief," he continued, his tone steady but tinged with a quiet sorrow, a leader acknowledging a lapse not just in others but in the vision he'd helped craft. The word struck a chord, a collective accountability settling over the diners and staff, a weight that pressed down on shoulders and bowed heads. Some lowered their gazes, ashamed of their silence, their complicity in letting the night unfold as it had, others nodded, moved by his sincerity, their eyes bright with a newfound respect. "The world is full of prejudice," he said, his voice rising slightly, a preacher addressing a congregation hungry for wisdom. "We judge people by their appearance, by the clothes they wear, the way they talk, what we assume they have or don't have. But I believe places like La Lumière must be different. This isn't just a place for the wealthy or the powerful, it's a place where everyone should feel welcome, where a man in a suit and a man in a t-shirt can sit at the same table and be treated the same. He paused again, his eyes settling on Emma, not with accusation, but with a look of encouragement, a silent invitation to rise above her missteps. We all make mistakes, he added, his tone softening, a bridge extended across the chasm of the night. What matters is what we learn from them. That's where the real strength lies, not in being right, but in being willing to change. Emma stood in the corner, her head still bowed, Shaq's words washing over her like a tide, eroding the walls she'd built around her pride. She knew there was no excuse that could erase her actions, no defense that could shield her from the lesson he delivered, and the weight of every gaze on her was a silent reminder of her responsibility, to her job, to the guests, to herself. Shaq turned to the staff, his tone resolute but warm, a leader rallying his team. La Lumière is not just a restaurant, it's a place where we build relationships, not based on wealth or appearances, but on respect and understanding. If any of you forget that, we don't just fail ourselves, we fail the people who trust us to be better. His words landed with a quiet force, a call to action that hung in the air, staff members nodding subtly, some hanging their heads in shame, others meeting his gaze with a flicker of resolve. Then, to the diners, his voice grew stronger, a clarion call that reached every corner. And it's not just about the staff, it's about all of us. We all have a responsibility to create a better space. When you see someone being treated unfairly, you have the right, and I believe the duty, to speak up. Silence can be complicity, and we've all been silent tonight in our own ways. The room erupted in soft applause, a wave that began with Lisa, her hands clapping with a fervor born of admiration, and spread like wildfire as Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, and others joined in, a chorus of agreement that filled the space with sound and meaning. Shaq raised a hand gently, signaling for silence, his presence a calming force amid the swell. He turned to Thompson, who stood nearby, his expression a mix of worry and gratitude, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I believe we can do better," Shaq said, his voice calm yet resolute, a promise wrapped in conviction. "I'd like to meet with the entire staff after closing tonight, it's time for change." Thompson nodded, his eyes shining with respect, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Of course, Shaq," he replied. "I'm sorry for what happened tonight, we'll make it right." Shaq sat back down, resuming his place at the table as if the powerful speech he'd just delivered, a sermon that had left the room in thoughtful silence, was nothing extraordinary, just another moment in a night already rich with lessons. But it was clear to everyone that his words had shifted something fundamental, a quiet revolution in a space that would never be the same, a ripple that would extend beyond these walls into the lives of those who'd witnessed it. After the last diners departed, La Lumière sank into a rare quiet, the chandeliers dimmed to a soft glow that bathed the room in a golden haze. The staff gathered in the main space, forming a circle around Shaq, who stood at the center with a calm yet commanding presence, his towering figure a lighthouse in the dimness. The light from above reflected on his face, highlighting the seriousness and sincerity in his eyes, a depth that drew every gaze. "Everyone makes mistakes," he began, his voice deep and steady, each word a stone laid in a foundation of renewal. "But what matters is what we learn from them. Mistakes don't define us, how we correct them does." He paused, letting his words sink in, a few staff members nodding slightly, their faces a mix of shame and resolve, as if recognizing that his message was for them all, not just the woman who'd sparked the night's drama. "This restaurant is not just a place to eat," he continued, his eyes sweeping the circle, meeting each pair with a quiet intensity. It's a space where people come to feel valued, to experience something special. Our job is to make sure anyone who walks through those doors feels welcomed, no matter how they're dressed, no matter what they say or don't say. His words struck Emma directly, a piercing truth that cut through the fog of her humiliation, her eyes glistening as she bit her lip, struggling to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Shaq's gaze settled on her, softening but firm, a teacher addressing a student poised on the edge of understanding. "Emma," he called, his voice gentle now, a lifeline extended across the room. "Today's been tough, not just for you, but for everyone here. I want to hear from you. What do you think we should do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" His question was an invitation, a chance for redemption she hadn't expected, and it hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Emma looked up, her eyes red and watery, her breath hitching as she took a deep, shuddering inhale. Every gaze in the room turned to her, a weight she felt like a physical burden, but she forced herself to speak, her voice trembling but growing steadier with each word. I'm sorry, Shaq," she said, the apology raw and unpolished, a crack in the shell she'd worn all night. "I was wrong, I let my own biases blind me, and I failed at my job, at being decent. I regret it, more than I can say." She took another breath, tears streaming down her cheeks now, leaving trails that glistened in the dim light. "I didn't realize respect isn't about how someone looks. I see that now, and I promise I'll change. I'll do better, for the guests, for this place, for myself." Her words faltered at the end, but they carried a sincerity that filled the silence, a vow born of a night she'd never forget. Shaq nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting a mix of gentleness and encouragement, a quiet approval that warmed the room. "That change is for you, Emma," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Not for me, not for anyone else. Change is a process, and I believe you can do it if you really want to. It's up to you now." His words weren't just for her, they resonated with everyone, a call to introspection that lingered in the air, a seed planted in fertile ground. He stepped toward the center of the circle, his voice dropping lower, a resonant hum that vibrated through the space. "This restaurant isn't defined by fancy tables or expensive dishes, it's defined by people, by how we treat each other and our guests. If we don't do that with respect and compassion, nothing else matters, not the food, not the lights, not the name on the door." The room fell silent, the soft sound of breathing the only counterpoint to his words, a collective pause as his message took root. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his voice full of gratitude, his hands clasped as if in prayer. "Shaq, thank you, for your words, for your patience. We'll make sure our team learns from this, not just tonight but every night, so La Lumière becomes what it's meant to be, a place where everyone feels welcome." His promise was earnest, a vow to honor the lesson delivered under his watch. Shaq nodded, a hint of relief in his eyes, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he looked around the room one last time. "Now's the time to start fresh, stronger, better," he concluded, his voice a quiet thunder. "I believe you all can do it, I wouldn't be here if I didn't." With that, he turned, the meeting dissolving into murmurs of reflection as the staff dispersed, each carrying a piece of the night's truth with them. Emma wiped her tears, a heavy burden lifting from her shoulders, replaced by a fragile determination, a resolve to change, not just for her job but for the person she wanted to become. In Shaq's gaze, she'd seen no resentment, only a glimmer of hope, and it fueled her, a spark in the darkness of her shame. As Shaq stepped outside, the glass doors of La Lumière closed gently behind him, the cool night air brushing against his skin like a whisper of renewal. Beverly Hills stretched before him, its lights twinkling like stars fallen to earth, the distant hum of traffic a soft lullaby to the stillness. He walked slowly, his sneakers silent now against the pavement, his mind lingering on the evening, a tapestry of conflict and redemption, a lesson not just for Emma or the staff, but for himself, a reminder of the power in kindness, in standing firm. He paused at a corner, the glow of a neon sign reflecting off his face, accentuating the lines of a man who'd seen judgment and risen above it time and again. The world needs more kindness, he thought, the words a quiet mantra. True strength isn't in tearing down, it's in lifting up, in the small choices we make every day. La Lumière, behind him, stood as a symbol now, not just of elegance, but of hope, of the possibility that even in a world of prejudice, compassion could carve a path forward.